Bank War, presented by Gia Hayes. As the 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson had intentions to be both a successful economic and political advocate for the common man. However, his huge determination leading him to succeed in destroying the Bank of the United States, in which he believed gave federal power and aristocratic privilege, both of which he opposed, caused the economy to suffer greatly for more than a century and the country to be divided politically. During his presidency, Jackson was very determined to live by his own principles. He firmly believed white male democracy was key and could only be preserved if African Americans and Indians were equally inferior, which expressed by Tocqueville in Document 1. Andrew Jackson opposed the federal government and aristocratic institutions having an emphasis of power, especially when it came to economic issues. This is seen by Jackson vetoing the Maysville Road in 1830. In Document 2, he defends his action by claiming that the bill was unconstitutional and also unwise because it would require the government to spend excessively. His opposition to aristocratic privilege and federal power was also demonstrated by his strong determination to destroy the Bank of the United States, which Jackson expresses in Document 7. The War of 1812 produced chaos in banking and exposed the shortcomings of the existing financial systems, which were the state banks. Therefore, Congress chartered a second Bank of the United States in 1816 that was essentially like the one Hamilton founded in 1791. To recover financially after the war and centralize the nation's debt. Many years before, Jefferson had fallen deeply in debt when his business that was based on paper credit had failed during the Panic of 1797. This caused him to be skeptical of all paper currency and all banks, especially those that issued banknotes, including the Bank of the United States. Jackson was adamant about not renewing the bank, which had an expiration date of 1836. After Jackson was elected for a second term, he made it his top priority to destroy the Bank of the United States as quickly as possible. Since he could not legally abolish the institution before its charter expired, he weakened the Bank of the United States by removing the government's deposits from the big institution and placing them in state banks. Consequently, financial conditions worsened, and Jacksonians resistantly blamed the recession on Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president. Eventually, Biddle stopped trying to save the bank in order to satisfy the agitated business community, and in 1836, the Bank of the United States died. Andrew Jackson's determination to destroy the bank was a result of his intention to support the common man. He believed the government was serving an injustice towards the common man by allowing the existence of a bank that was only making the rich richer and those with power more powerful, according to Document 7. However, as a result of Jackson forcing the abolishment of the Bank of the United States, a growing opposition against Jackson, known as the Whigs, was stimulated by the mid-1830s. The nation once again had two competing political parties, the newly formed Whigs and the Democrats. It also resulted in economic instability for more than a century. A nationwide economic boom, particularly in the land business, was reaching its peak in 1836. Land sales were high, which generated a series of ample federal budget surpluses that were given to the states each year effective in 1836 by Congress per the Distribution Act. The same year, not long before Jackson left office, he issued the Specie Circular to stop the government from accepting payment of various state bank notes unsupported by gold and silver for the purchase of good land. The specie circular required the government to only accept gold or silver coins or currency securely backed by gold or silver as payment for public lands. Unfortunately, this caused the Panic of 1837, which began shortly after Martin Van Buren was elected as president in 1836. Numerous businesses and banks failed, prices declined, unemployment increased, and morale decreased. It was a very depressing and hard time in America for all people, including the common man.
Indian Removal Act presented by Guadalupe Ramos. Although early Americans believed that Native Americans were noble savages, after Andrew Jackson came into power in the early 19th century, Americans started to change their ideas about the natives. The common man was also in Jackson's idea. They only wanted the natives to move there so they could live there, even though Supreme Court disagreed with the Jackson and the common man. When the first colonies were settled in America, relations between the natives and the whites ranged from respected friends to hated enemies. When Jackson was elected president, just after 1 year, Jackson pushed a new bill through Congress, the Indian Removal Act in 1830. This gave Jackson the power to make treaties with the natives living east to moving west. Andrew Jackson believed that in order to have a perfect nation, it was needed to remove the Indians to the west side of the Mississippi River. He went to Congress, and with his first annual message addressing his case of the Removal Act on December 8, 1829, he announced that the Removal Act will be important to the United States, individual states, and the natives. As Jackson thought, if we removed the Native Americans, it would prevent issues between the federal and state governments. He also believed that it would help civilization and population by just having the common men. On May 28, 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Treaty of the Removal Act of the Native Americans, which meant the government had the power to relocate the natives. Most of the Native American tribes just left without saying a word, but the 5 tribes gave the most resistance. The 5 tribes were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and the Seminole Nations. In the Worcester v. Virginia in 1832, the Supreme Court stated that Native Americans could not be forced to move, but Jackson ignored the decision. The 5 tribes were well known because they not only refused to move, they took traits the settlers had so they could coexist. They even had slaves so they could fit in with the white Americans. We wish to remain on our land of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to remain without interruption or molestation. The treaties with us and laws of the United States made in pursuance of treaties guarantee our residence and our privileges and secure us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties may be fulfilled and these laws executed. The Cherokees said this because all they wanted was peace and to stay in their land. In Georgia, the Cherokees tried to stop the whites by having the Supreme Court on their side. During the whole Indian Removal Act, there was the Black Hawk War from 1831 to 1832 between the white settlers, Sac and Fox. These Native Americans had lost their Illinois lands in a treaty signed in St. Louis in 1804. Conflict between Sac and Fox and the United States in 1832 after the War of 1812, whites settling the Illinois country exerted pressure on the Native Americans. The Chickasaw was the most different from all the other tribes. The other tribes got convinced by who exchanged land grants, but the Chickasaw were moved by getting $3 million from the white settlers. The Seminole refused to leave their lands in Florida, leading to the Second Seminole War. The Seminole used surprise attacks to defeat the U.S. Army in many battles. By 1838, only about 2,000 Cherokees had left their Georgia homeland for Indian Territory. President Martin Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers to expedite the removal process. Scott and his troops forced the Cherokee into stockades at Bayonet Point while whites looted their homes and belongings. Then they marched the Indians to Indian Territory. Cough, typhus, cholera, and starvation were epidemics along the way, and more than 5,000 Cherokee died. By 1840, tens of thousands of Native Americans had been driven off their land in the southeastern states and forced to move across the Mississippi into Indian Territory. The federal government promised that their new land would remain unmolested forever, but as the line of white settlement pushed westward, Indian country shrank. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state and Indian Territory was gone for good. In the end of the Indian Removal Act, the white settlers got their way by sending the Indians west. The Nullification Crisis, presented by Jordan Mallard. Although a major crisis was averted, the nullification crisis was still a crisis that led to turmoil in some places. President Jackson did not act on it like he should have, and this caused problems. With that, the statement, as 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson was both a successful economic and political advocate for the common man, is untrue. This can be seen by using the documents and outside knowledge to look at what happened during the nullification crisis, how this affected the states, and what others, and especially Andrew Jackson, did to try and stop the crisis. By looking at these, it becomes apparent that during the nullification crisis, Andrew Jackson was not a successful economic nor political advocate for the common man during this era. In the beginning of his presidency and before the nullification crisis, Andrew Jackson was someone who believed that democracy and equality should be simple. It should give equal protection and equal benefits to all white male citizens of these states. Of course, his ideas had to change with the development of new problems and disagreements among men. This is when we begin to question whether or not he was an advocate for the common man. With his belief of equal protection and benefits, it seems as if he is both a political and economic advocate for the common man, for all white men were granted the right to vote without land or class restrictions. However, there are other races living in the United States at this time who are not getting the rights as those white men are. In Document 1, Alexis de Tocqueville talks about how the white man attracts the eye first, followed by African Americans and then Indians. The author then talks about how African Americans and Indians have an equally inferior position in the country, and that they both experience the effects of tyranny. So does this mean that the only common man is the white man? African Americans and Indians have always held an inferior position in the United States, but Andrew Jackson didn't do anything to change that. So even though he intended to make things equal, he left out some other groups that lived in the country at the same time. This kind of sets the scene for the rest of Jackson's presidency. Jackson believed in reducing some of the power of the federal government, for it would prevent people to gain political connections. However, on the other hand, he believed in forceful presidential leadership, and he was committed to the preservation of the Union. Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, played an important role in the beginnings of the nullification and in the nullification crisis. Calhoun has once strongly supported the tariff of 1816. However, the people of his home state of South Carolina began to believe that the tariff of abominations was the reason their economy was not improving. It turned out that the tariff wasn't really the problem for the unchanging economy. It was actually because of the results of exhaustion of farmland. South Carolinians even considered secession from the United States. Document 6 talks about how South Carolina threatened to secede from the states. It states that if South Carolina were to secede, plenty of other states would follow, but they didn't. Calhoun realized that his opinions on the tariff would affect his home state, which would then affect his political position, so he decided to come up with the theory of nullification, which acted as an alternative to secession. He took ideas from the ideas of Madison and Jefferson and their Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and he cited the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. With that, he argued that since the federal government was a creation of the states and not Congress, or the judicial branch, the states were the final arbiters or mediators of the constitutionality of federal laws. Calhoun argues that the states have more power than the federal government, and that they can and should be able to decide if a law is unconstitutional. If a state were to decide that a law is unconstitutional, then it could hold a special convention and declare the law null and void it in the state. Calhoun called this his nullification doctrine and used it to nullify the tariff of 1828, which meant that he gained support from South Carolina. Calhoun's ideas had good intentions, but it is ironic that he supported the tariff at first, then quickly changed his mind once he knew his political status was in jeopardy. Calhoun's dreams of president were shot down by Martin Van Buren, and the concept of nullification began to cause some problems. In 1830, another controversy arose over land. During a debate over federal policy in western lands, a senator from Connecticut proposed that all surveys of land sales be halted temporarily. A senator from South Carolina, Robert Hayne, argued that slowing down the growth of the West would mean that the East could keep their political and economic power. Although he didn't have much interest in Western lands, he hoped that his argument would gain him support from the Westerners in Congress, and hopefully listen to South Carolina's plea and lower the tariff. He said that both the South and the West were victims of tyranny in the Northeast. Now a senator from Massachusetts, Daniel Webster, answered Hayne and challenged him to a debate on states' power versus national power. Hayne, who was coached by Calhoun, responded and defended the theory of nullification. Then Webster spent 2 afternoons delivering his second reply to Hayne, which was a powerful speech that would go down in history. Everyone waited for Jackson's thoughts on the argument at a Democratic Party banquet, and he answered, "With our federal union, it must be preserved." It is said that Calhoun then responded with, "The union next to our liberty most dear," putting the freedom and equality in front of preservation of the union. This created a rift between Jackson and Calhoun. The Webster-Hayne debate played an important role in the start of the nullification crisis. Webster pretty much sides with President Jackson and Hayne sides with Calhoun. Webster really only cares about preserving the Union, while Hayne really pushes nullification. Documents 4 and 5 talk about the debate. Document 4 is by Robert Hayne and talks about him advocating nullification of the Tariff of 1828. His opinions are clear. For example, he says, "The South is acting on a principle she had always held sacred, resistance to unauthorized taxation. It is apparent that the South has always been a victim of taxation and doesn't need any more." Document 5 talks about Webster's stance and says, "Who has given, or who can give, to the state legislators a right to alter it, either by interference, construction, or otherwise?" He is asking who gives the power to the states to nullify the Constitution when people have chosen it to keep it as it is. This debate just sets the stage for more disagreements to come. In 1832, the issues and controversy over nullification finally reached a breaking point. The controversy produced a crisis after the South Carolinians angrily responded to the tariff bill, and that didn't relieve them from the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations. The legislature called for a state convention that voted to nullify the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 and prevent the collection of duties in the state. At the same time, Hayne was selected as governor and Calhoun was selected as senator of South Carolina. President Jackson stated that nullification was treason, and those who were for it were traitors. He ordered a warship and many revenue ships to Charleston, and when Congress was brought together in 1833, he proposed a force bill that would allow the president to use the military to ensure that the acts of Congress were followed. Calhoun didn't know what to do. South Carolina was falling apart. Then, newly elected Senate Henry Clay averted a crisis by coming up with a compromise where the tariff would be gradually lowered so that it would be about the same level it was at 1816 by 1842. Jackson signed both the force bill and the compromise on the same day. The convention in South Carolina appealed its nullification of the tariffs, but nullified the Force Act. In the end, Calhoun and his followers claimed a victory. When analyzing the events of the nullification crisis, how it affected the states and the people involved, it became more and more apparent that not only was Andrew Jackson not an advocate for the common man, but he also didn't play a huge role in solving the problems that the nullification crisis created. Jackson became more and more concerned about keeping the Union alive than catering to the needs of the people. In Document 4, he talks about why he vetoed the Maysville Road that was going to connect the Ohio River to Lexington, Kentucky. He talks about excessive spending and how debts need to be paid before spending money on a bridge. Jackson says that the prosperity of manufacturers and labor is essential to the national safety and independence of his country. However, Document 1 talks about how African Americans and Indians are still inferior, and they are the ones doing the hard labor. So Jackson thinks labor is important, but African Americans and Indians still aren't treated fairly? That doesn't make much sense. During the nullification crisis, Jackson wasn't really concerned with the tariff. He was more concerned with the Union, as he stated in his response to the Webster-Hayne debate. When it comes down to it, the documents and outside knowledge revealed that Andrew Jackson was not a political nor economic advocate for the common man during the event of the nullification